Welcome to the Lost Archives. Quiet stories from forgotten history. Each night, we open a single file from the past. A vanished city, a misplaced discovery, a life almost erased from record. There is no spectacle here, no urgency, only the patient unfolding of what once was. And together, we'll turn the page. Along the coast of Sidon, the smell reached you before the city did. Rotting shellfish in open vats, baking under the Mediterranean sun. That was the price of the most expensive color in the ancient world. The murex is a small predatory sea snail found on rocky seafloors throughout the Mediterranean. 3 species were harvested: Bolinus brandaris, Hexaplex trunculus, and Stramonita hemastoma. Each lived in shallow coastal water. Each carried beneath its mantle a single small gland. Inside each snail, beneath the mantle, sits the hypobranchial gland, a structure no larger than a grain of rice. It produces a pale yellow fluid, almost colorless when first extracted. Left in sunlight, it begins to shift: yellow, green, blue. Then, slowly, a deep red purple. The transformation takes hours. The compound responsible is 6,6 dibromoindigo, a brominated form of the common dye indigo and one of the only organobromine molecules produced naturally by an animal. The bromine is drawn from seawater itself, incorporated into the gland by a specific enzyme. In 1909, German chemist Paul Friedländer needed to identify the compound precisely. He collected 12,000 murex snails and extracted their glands by hand. His total yield, 1.4 grams of pure pigment. That ratio, roughly 8,600 snails per gram, explains why the dye cost what it did. The historian Pliny the Elder noted that harvesting had to be done at the right time of year. After the rising of Sirius in midsummer, the snail's glands were fullest. Before spring, the secretion had already been discharged, and the juice had no consistency. Workers planned their seasons around the snail's reproductive cycle. After collection, the shells were cracked open with stone hammers. For larger species, only the gland was removed. For smaller ones, the entire body was mashed into a paste. This paste was combined with salt, 1 part salt to 8 parts flesh by weight, and left to ferment for 3 days. After 3 days of fermentation, the liquefied mass was transferred into large heated vats and combined with water. Ancient accounts describe lead-lined bronze vats maintained at low heat. Modern reconstructions place the temperature at roughly 45 degrees Celsius. Wool immersed in the vat emerged green. Exposed to air, it oxidized over several hours to purple. The most prized grade was dyed twice, first in one vat, then a second. This double dipping produced a near-black red, described in ancient texts as the color of clotted blood. It was this shade, not a bright violet, that emperors and kings actually wore. Strabo, writing in the 1st century BCE, recorded that the dye works made the city of Tyre unpleasant to live in, but simultaneously made it rich. The smell was so severe that in some jurisdictions, dye works were required by law to be placed outside city walls. The earliest physical evidence of purple dye production dates not to Phoenicia but to Minoan Crete. Excavations at the small island of Phoenicia off southeast Crete uncovered murex shell deposits dated to approximately 1750 BCE. Frescoes from the island of Thera, dated around 1550 BCE, appear to show purple-dyed garments. Phoenician production is documented from at least 1200 BCE, with Sidon dominating the industry through the 12th and 11th centuries. From the 10th century BCE onward, Tyre eclipsed Sidon as the primary production centre. The dye's Latin name, purpura Tyria, comes from this period of Tyrian dominance. Production was not confined to Tyre. Along the Levantine coast, workshops operated at Sidon, Sarepta, 14 kilometers south of Sidon, Berytus, Arwad, and Akko. Each city maintained its own dye operations. Each competed for access to the same coastal murex beds. Tel Shikmona is the most thoroughly excavated single dye factory ever found. In a 2025 study in the journal PLOS One, researchers documented 176 production artifacts from the site. 135 of them were stained with purple pigment. The ceramic vats at Tel Shikmona were 1 meter tall and 80 centimeters wide, each holding approximately 350 liters. At peak operation, 15 to 20 ran simultaneously. The factory operated continuously for 500 years, from roughly 1100 BCE until the Babylonian invasion of approximately 586 BCE. Just south of Sidon's old harbour stands a hill formed almost entirely from crushed murex shells, the accumulated waste of centuries of production. The hill is 50 meters high. Billions of individual snails, processed and discarded over generations, built it layer by layer. Pliny the Elder recorded a geography of quality. The best Asian purple came from Tyre, the best European from Laconia in Greece, the best African from the island of Meninx off Tunisia. This regional variation reflected differences in local murex species, water temperature, and the particular mineral content of each coastline. Phoenician merchants moved the dye along established maritime routes, south to Egypt, north into Greece, west along the North African coast to Carthage, and from there into Spain and the Western Mediterranean. The dye travelled in two forms: raw concentrate for workshops with the technical means to dye locally, and pre-dyed cloth for markets that lacked them. The historian Theopompus, writing in the 4th century BCE, reported that at Colophon in Asia Minor, purple dye was traded at its weight in silver. That was the price floor. By the time of the Roman Empire, it had climbed far beyond silver. In 301 CE, the Emperor Diocletian issued an edict setting maximum prices on 1,400 goods, from wine to wages to military equipment. The entries for Tyrian Purple were the single highest-priced items in the entire document. 1 Roman pound of Tyrian Purple dye, 150,000 denarii, 3 times its weight in gold. 1 pound of purple-dyed wool, 50,000 denarii, equal to its weight in gold. 1 pound of purple-dyed silk, also 150,000 denarii. Diocletian annotated that last entry, to be sold only at the direction of the emperor, under penalty of death. For scale, a farm labourer in Diocletian's empire earned roughly 25 denarii per day. A single gram of Tyrian purple dye represented approximately 2 years of wages. To dye a single toga required considerably more than a gram. Roman law structured who could wear which shade and how much of it. Senators wore a single purple stripe, the clavus, on their toga. Senior magistrates wore a wider stripe. Generals celebrating a triumph received the toga picta, entirely purple, embroidered with gold thread. The emperor alone wore full purple as a permanent fixture of office. Pliny recorded the only surviving ancient formula for the dye bath. To dye 1,000 Roman pounds of wool required 200 pounds of purpura flesh, combined with 111 pounds of murex flesh, boiled together. The ratio implies a continuous supply chain of enormous scale running behind every dyed garment. The hexaplex trunculus snail introduced a variable that ancient dyers had to manage with care. If the dye bath was exposed to strong direct sunlight during processing, the dye compound partially broke down, and the wool came out blue, not purple. Ancient Jewish texts describe this blue, called techelet, produced deliberately from the same snail by controlling exactly how much light reached the vat. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great captured Tyre after a 7-month siege, among the most difficult military operations of his campaign. When his forces reached the royal treasury at Persepolis, they found purple textiles estimated at a combined value of 5,000 talents, confirmation that the dye was functioning as stored wealth. After Alexander's conquest, Tyre's dye industry continued under successive Hellenistic and then Roman administration. New rulers collected its revenues rather than dismantling its operations. By the 1st century CE, Tyre and Berytus together supplied the majority of Roman demand. Ancient authors noted that murex populations along the Phoenician coast were visibly declining by the Roman period. Centuries of intensive harvesting had reduced snail numbers in shallow water near the production cities. Boats were forced farther offshore into deeper water to find sufficient supply. Purple also served as a high-level diplomatic instrument. Byzantine emperors later sent purple silk as formal gifts to rulers from Persia to the Abbasid caliphs to China, not because it was decorative, but because only one institution in the world could produce it. The cloth itself announced the sender's position. Tyre in the Roman period was among the most prosperous cities in the eastern Mediterranean, minting its own coins, exporting purple cloth to Rome, its law school at nearby Berytus training jurists who shaped Roman legislation for centuries. The dye trade had funded it all. Julius Caesar wore an entirely purple toga as Dictator Perpetuo in the final months before his assassination. His killers cited it explicitly as evidence of monarchical ambition. To wear purple without constitutional authorization was not a fashion choice. It was a political declaration that others were expected to read as a claim to kingship. The Emperor Nero moved beyond sumptuary rules into direct market seizure. According to Suetonius, Nero sent imperial agents into the dye markets of Rome, not to regulate, but to buy small quantities of purple from merchants. Those purchases became legal grounds to close every dye shop in the city. The supply chain itself became imperial property. Under Domitian, wearing purple without authorization became a charge of treason rather than a sumptuary violation. Individuals were prosecuted for the color as a direct political threat to imperial authority. A stripe on the wrong toga was enough to bring a man before the emperor's tribunal. In the early 5th century, Theodosius II issued legislation framing unauthorized use of the deep Tyrian purple as equivalent to high treason, crimen laesae majestatis. The charge carried the same legal consequences as plotting against the emperor's life: confiscation of all property, exile, and execution. Justinian the Fine codified the death penalty for unauthorized purchase or use of Tyrian purple in his Corpus Juris Civilis, completed in 534 CE. For the first time, the prohibition was not the decree of an individual emperor. It was written into the permanent legal foundation of Roman civilization. Justinian did not only restrict the dye, he nationalized its production entirely. The workshops inside the Great Palace complex were staffed by hereditary laborers. The profession passed from father to son, overseen by state officials, and workers could not leave their trade. They were, in practice, a captive technical caste. The workshops produced several classified grades: holoverum, fully saturated single-dip purple; blatter, the near black-red reserved for imperial documents and the innermost court; debuffer, double-dyed, used only in items personally designated by the emperor. Each grade had its own rules governing who could receive it. Procopius recorded that Justinian's centralization had a direct consequence on the provinces. The imperial buyout of raw silk materials and control of dye supplies led to, in his words, the ruin of the silk industries at Tyre and Berytus. The ancient Phoenician workshops, still operating after 1500 years, were strangled by their own empire's monopoly. Inside the Great Palace, the emperors had embedded the color into the structure of dynastic legitimacy. The maternity room where empresses gave birth was lined entirely with porphyry, a purple-veined stone quarried in Egypt, and was called the porphyra. Children born there received the title porphyrogenitos, born in the purple. Constantine VII, who ruled in the 10th century, built his entire claim to imperial authority on this title. Porphyrogenitos, born in the purple, distinguished those who had arrived at power through birth from those who had taken it by force. The dye had become a form of biological credential. Beginning in the 7th century, the Arab conquests of the Levant removed the remaining provincial dye operations from Byzantine control. Tyre, Berytus, and the Phoenician coastal workshops passed under Umayyad administration. Constantinople's own workshops now stood as the sole remaining organized center of purple production in the world. Through the 11th and 12th centuries, the Byzantine state weakened under Crusader incursions, Seljuk territorial losses, and internal political fragmentation. The imperial workshops continued, but the institution that sustained them was contracting. Fewer state resources meant less oversight, less raw material, fewer trained workers replacing those who died. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople caused the first major rupture. The city was stripped of its treasury, craftsmen dispersed, institutions damaged. The workshops were partially rebuilt after Byzantine reoccupation in 1261, but the administrative continuity that had sustained the operation for 700 years had been broken. By the 14th century, substitute dyes had entered wide circulation. Kermes, from a scale insect, produced intense reds blendable to approximate purple. Orchil, from Mediterranean lichens, was cheaper and more widely available, though less stable in sunlight. For most buyers, the chemical distinction had ceased to matter. On the 29th of May, 1453, Ottoman forces under Sultan Mehmed II breached the walls of Constantinople after a 53-day siege. The Great Palace complex was seized. The imperial workshops, whatever remained of them after 2 centuries of decline, ceased to function. The hereditary workshop families, the people who had carried the technical knowledge across generations, scattered in the days following the fall. No written manual, no craftsman's guide, no production record from the Byzantine workshops has ever been found. The knowledge had been transmitted orally within families inside a single institution. The industry that had operated in documented form for more than 2,600 years stopped, not because the snails had disappeared, not because the chemistry had changed, because the institution that held the knowledge had ended abruptly and could not be reconstituted from any surviving document because no such document existed. The Western Church, which had relied on Byzantine Constantinople as a source of authentic purple for vestments and liturgical objects, found its supply cut off entirely. Church workshops turned to overdyes, woad and madder combined to approximate the color. The approximations served their purpose, but faded faster and could not replicate the molecular stability of murex dye. 40 years after Constantinople fell, Spanish ships returned from the Americas carrying cochineal, a dye from a scale insect found on Mexican cactus plants. Cochineal produced crimsons and purples of extraordinary intensity and stability. Within decades, it had restructured the entire European dye trade and made every prior substitute commercially irrelevant. In 1856, an 18-year-old British chemistry student named William Henry Perkin was attempting to synthesize quinine in his home laboratory. He failed and produced instead a dark sludge that, when diluted, turned a vivid purple. He patented it as Movine, the world's first synthetic dye, and opened a factory within the year. Within decades of Perkin's discovery, synthetic dye factories made natural purple economically irrelevant. Communities built on kermes, orchil, and weld production collapsed. The entire natural colorant trade that had structured Mediterranean commerce for 3,000 years was superseded in a single generation. By the time archaeologists began excavating Phoenician sites in the late 19th century, the knowledge of how Tyrian purple had been produced was so thoroughly lost that early researchers misidentified the shell mounds as ordinary refuse heaps, not as the industrial waste of a production system that had operated at continental scale for 1,500 years. The Phoenicians who built this industry did not understand the chemistry of what they were doing. They knew, through generations of practice, the precise conditions that produced the color: the salting ratio, the fermentation window, the vat temperature, the effect of light. That empirical knowledge, built through centuries of repetition, proved more fragile than any written formula. The Byzantine workshop families who inherited that empirical knowledge could not have anticipated that the institution enclosing them, the empire itself, would end quickly enough to break the chain entirely. Knowledge held inside a single institution has only one point of failure. In 1453, that point was reached. Tyre today is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Its Roman-era hippodrome and colonnaded streets are excavated and documented. The dye quarter that made it the wealthiest city in the ancient Mediterranean is marked now by nothing more than shell fragments in the soil and a faint discoloration in the earth beneath the Roman pavements. Roman Tyre minted its own coins. It operated a law school at nearby Berytus, whose graduates shaped Roman legislation across the empire. It exported purple cloth to Rome itself. Every layer of that prosperity traced back to the same origin: men cracking shells on a coastline 3,000 years earlier. Pliny noted one final detail about the murex industry that reads differently now than it might have then. The snails had grown so scarce near the Phoenician cities that fishermen no longer found them in the shallows. The industry had consumed, over 1,500 years, quantities of shellfish that left the nearshore habitat structurally depleted. It had nearly harvested its own raw material to exhaustion. Murex Hill still stands near Sidon, partially built over now, but the core of it remains, 50 meters of compacted shell visible from the road. It is the largest physical monument to the dye industry that built Phoenicia, unremarkable to those who do not know what they are looking at. The 2025 excavation documented the most complete picture yet of what the industry looked like at ground level. 176 production artifacts, 135 of them stained. 500 continuous years of work in a single coastal site, the longest documented run of any single craft operation in the ancient Mediterranean world. In January 2021, 3 wool fragments from the Timna Valley copper smelting site were confirmed as genuine Tyrian Purple radiocarbon dated to approximately 1000 BCE. Chemical analysis found both 6-monobromoindigotin and 6,6-dibromoindigotin in the correct ratio, the precise molecular fingerprint of murex dye. They are currently the oldest confirmed purple-dyed textiles in the southern Levant. Chemist Zvi Koren spent years applying high-performance liquid chromatography to textiles in museum collections across Europe, previously catalogued as authentic Tyrian Purple. Many failed. Samples described in institutional records as genuine turned out to be overdyes of madder and indigo. The genuine article, it emerged, is rarer in museum collections today than it was in antiquity. In 1859, French zoologist Henri Lacaze-Duthier became the first modern researcher to systematically document the color change sequence of fresh murex secretion under sunlight. He recorded the progression from pale yellow through green to blue to purple, and identified that it was light driving the transformation, not heat. It was the first step toward reconstructing what had been lost. In January 2001, researcher Inge Bjørsken-Canold became the first person in modern history to successfully reconstruct a functional murex diabath. Using fresh hexaplex trunculus glands, potash to achieve the right alkalinity, and a double boiler held at 45 degrees for 1 week, the procedure that had defeated earlier attempts finally worked. Canold noticed something that does not appear in any surviving ancient text. Whether the dyeing was done in darkness or in direct daylight changed the color entirely. In shade, a violet purple. In sunlight, a blue purple shifting toward blue. The ancient dyers had known this, it was embedded in their practice, but they had never written it down. In November 2020, researchers at Seoul National University published a method for producing 6,6-dibromoindigo in engineered bacteria. 3 enzymes inserted into Escherichia coli converted tryptophan into 315 milligrams per liter of the compound, the first biologically produced Tyrian Purple at meaningful scale. It required no snails. The murex snails are still here. Bolinus brandaris and Hexaplex trunculus are found today along the same coastlines where Phoenician workers harvested them 3,000 years ago. The populations recovered once the harvesting pressure ended. The biology was never the problem. What was lost in 1453 was not a recipe. It was an arrangement. Specific people, in a specific place, inside a specific institution, transmitting knowledge that existed in no written form. When the institution ended abruptly, the arrangement could not be reconstructed, because no document captured what had only ever lived in the hands of the people doing the work. 26 centuries of a single craft. From Minoan Crete to Byzantine Constantinople, the longest continuous production run of any color in recorded history. The archivist sets down the scroll.